You can start now.
Okay, so I would like to welcome you to Climate Change and Energy Transition panel of the Conference for Strategies for Transformative Global Leadership. We will discuss one of the significant issues at this panel on how climate change will influence energy transition. Recently, we all joined the Paris Agreement, and in that agreement, world governments decided to limit the increase of temperature to significantly less than 2 degrees, which is something that is usually interpreted as 1.5 degrees. I will have excellent panelists here with me. One of them is Ernst von Weizsäcker, who is honorary president of Club of Rome. He is very long in the area. Then the second one is Natasha Markowska, who is a member of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Then Ian Dunlop, a member of Club of Rome. And Shir Kilkish, who is lead author of the assessment report number 6. In the beginning, I will give a short introduction, and then I will invite 4 panelists to give initial pitch, 5 minutes each. Then we will have a discussion on the questions, which we think are important for this topic. And then we will accept questions from the general public. So coming back to 1.5 degrees, what do we know now? That if we want to keep temperature under 1.5 degrees until the end of century, then we have to globally decrease carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. Which means that in developing countries, we should actually do it by 55 to 60% by 2030. 2030 is tomorrow. That means we have to make decisions very quickly. Phasing out of coal is fact in many places, in Europe, North America. I hope soon it will become a general rule everywhere, but we have to actually decarbonize most of our power system by 2030. But we cannot stop at power system only. We have to look into the heating system, which is using around 40% of final energy in northern climates, and decarbonizing of heating should generally mean that we cannot really use natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, in the heating system anymore. We should do very fast replacement of natural gas with some other technologies. We have to start, I guess, now. And also, regarding the transport, we have to see what are the options to quickly replace oil-based internal combustion engines with some other solution. Can we do it? How to do it? And what are the barriers? This is the questions for this panel. So as my first speaker, I would like to ask Ernst to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Nevin. We have received this global leadership paper in which it begins with the guidelines. Each seminar is meant to go by what they call PASS, problem analysis, solutions, strategies. This is also the architecture of a little paper which Nevin and I have been writing a couple of weeks ago, which has been circulated. It's available. The problem is climate. I leave that essentially to Ian Dunlop and also to Natasha and Sir, and go immediately to the question of analysis and solutions. The analysis has been outlined by Nevin. For the solutions, essentially we have two options or three. First, decarbonize energy, meaning renewable energies instead of coal, etc. Second, reduce the need for energy. Some 10 years ago, together with an Australian team, Ian, I wrote a book called Factor 5, in which we demonstrate that a 5-fold increase of energy efficiency is technically available. To more or less illustrate what I'm saying is the following question. I'm asking all my students always. Imagine Mount Everest, very, very tall mountain. Imagine a bucket of water 10 kilograms heavy. How many kilowatt hours would you need to lift that bucket of water to the top of Mount Everest? And the average estimate by the students is something like 100 or 1,000 kilowatt hours. This is totally wrong. You need only 1/4 of 1 kilowatt hour to do it. Meaning a kilowatt hour is a powerhouse. But we treat it as if it was a bloody little nonsense and waste it no end. And this is part of the problem. So we have to learn, this is a technological challenge, to do with a lot less energy, not only solar, because wind and water and all that have their ecological limits. Okay, then strategy. Of course, we need rules, we need standards, but then most importantly, we need prices. Prices have to more or less tell the ecological truth. Today, they are blatantly lying, you know? They do as if they don't cost anything. If we had added the negative effects of coal burning, etc., it would be extremely expensive. Okay, but then there is the north-south problem. The north has already more or less exhausted the budget for damaging the atmosphere. The south has not. This budget approach would force the north to go shopping to developing countries, buying some new permits for every car, for every stove or so they are using to burn, you know. If we install that budget approach, it would become profitable for a country like India or Cameroon or Ecuador to stop building coal power plants. Today, some 500 additional coal power plants are under construction or planned. This has to be stopped if we want to go minus 40% by 2030. So I think this is all I wanted to say, and now we can go on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernst. Now what I would invite Natasha. Natasha, floor is yours. You have a presentation, so share it to us.
Can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
For now, we just see you.
And now? Let's click on yes.
Yes, now it's starting.
Yes, and I have to
Maximize it.
maximize it, right? Yeah. Thank you, Nevin. Thank you all for inviting me to be in such a competent and nice company to discuss this very important topic and issue which connects energy and climate change in the same manner. So I will provide some views about the issue on solutions which comes from the robust science prepared for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the body, international body, which in a way creates and approves the science, which is the basis upon which the politicians take their decisions about what kind of targets and political solutions will they take in order to address this global problem. And upon the findings of this science, in fact, all the underlying goals are somehow found their basis in the IPCC science. And it was on the invitation on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that's in October 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change provided a special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and related global greenhouse gases emission pathways, which are known as 1.5 degree pathways, or this report SR 1.5. Citing over 6,000 scientific references and using contributions of 91 authors, this report does not only assess what a 1.5 degree warmer world would look like, but also the different pathways by which global temperature rise could be limited to 1.5 degrees is analyzed in this report. So all of the 1.5 scenarios have global emissions peaking around 2020. And as can be seen in the figure on the left-hand side. And dropping to near zero between 2040 and 2060. And again, all of the scenarios have some degree of net negative emissions in the later part of the century. Through the amount, though the amount varies between 5 to 32 gigatons CO2 equivalent by the year 2100. And these are the key messages to policymakers. So to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, global CO2 emissions must peak and then decline rapidly to net zero. And in addition, negative emission of some sort are likely to be needed with their scale and nature depending on the other choices. That is the first message stemming out of this figure. And the other one is that the other result about the temperature is that the temperatures temporarily breach the 1.5 degree limit. This is the second figure on the right-hand side, around mid-century, and in all 1.5 degree scenarios. Warming reaches between 1.6 and 1.8 degrees before falling later in the century as emissions become net negative. Further about the common futures of the 1.5 degree pathways. it is clear that by mid-century, CO2 emissions falling to net zero, with renewables supplying 70% to 85% of electricity and unabated coal use being largely phased out. Also, all 1.5-degree pathways with limited or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal in the order of 100 to 1,000 tons gigatons CO2 equivalent over the 21st century. And why this carbon dioxide removal is necessary for both moving to net zero emissions and for producing net negative emissions to compensate for any overshoot of 1.5 degrees. But there is a big but here. It must be noted that carbon dioxide removal deployed at such a scale at the moment is not proven and poses a major risk to our ability to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Then about decarbonization of transport and heating sectors, I would note that there is a broad agreement that the global energy system must be increasingly electrified while shifting away from fossil fuels and towards renewables in order to meet the stringent climate goals. So please look at the figure on the left. Today, only 20% of the world's final energy comes from electricity. All of the 1.5 scenarios in the figure show this increasingly rapidly to between 46 and 71% in 2100. This is because it is easier to decarbonize electricity than it is to eliminate emissions from the thousands of small sources burning fossil fuels for space heating, industry, or for transportation. As mentioned many times, fossil fuels drops dramatically in all 1.5 degrees pathways from around 83% of primary energy as of today to between to around 2 and 43% in 2100, depending on the scenarios. Renewables, of course, we have a large shift to them, include solar, wind, and hydro, as well as expanded use of biofuels. And often the biofuels are tied to negative emissions, generating biomass with carbon capture and storage. I would like to finish with a national perspective of decarbonization, which seen through Macedonian case, the country I come from, is very much similar to the global perspective. Namely, as shown for the latest mitigation analysis conducted in the country for the purpose of the National Energy and Climate Plan, 82% of the emissions in 2030 can be cut compared to 1990 levels if the following is applied in a timely manner: renewables plus intensive energy efficiency, definitely phasing out of coal. In my country, we use most of the coal has a dominant role for electricity generation. Gas maintained, the use of gas is maintained only for combined heat and power production in cities and industry. Sector coupling, this electrification again at national level of heat and transport sectors, and more use of district heating and heat pumps, leading again to electrification of heating sector. With that, I would like to finalize my intervention. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Natasha. Though timing was a little bit longer, around double. Ian, floor is yours now. Now we have seen what we have to do, and now let us see what the South thinks. Though geographical South, I don't think that Ernest meant by South Australia. Australia is part of the North from the point of view of climate. So can you share your screen?
Yes, I will. Whoops.
Natasha, I think you have to unshare yours. Yes.
Okay, hold on. Okay. Is that okay? I hope we can all see it. Well, for my 5 minutes, I'd just like to give perhaps a bit of an unusual view of climate change and where we sit, in the sense where as I see it, that we face a far greater urgency for action than is being talked about officially, because the climate position at the moment, I think, represents an immediate existential threat to the future of humanity. And I'd just like to explain why that is in a very short demonstration. Firstly, the Paris Climate Agreement, I think we've seen this diagram before. The actual emissions to the left of the diagram, if we want to hit the Paris targets below 2 degrees C, then those are the lines we have to follow to the right to get down and stay below, in this case, 2 degrees C, with a 66% chance of doing it. Now, unfortunately, that's the trajectory we're currently on. And if you take the Paris Agreement and you implement everything that was agreed in 2015, that's where we would end up. So we're not dropping emissions at all, which is what we have to do, and do it very quickly. We're actually just leveling them off. So the rhetoric, between the rhetoric and reality in Paris, there's a yawning gap. And that's the biggest challenge the world now faces, I think far more urgent than COVID in many respects. We have to get emissions down extremely quickly. So what does all this mean? Well, we hear a lot of talk. We've already seen warming of 1 degree C from the pre-industrial level. The upper limit of Paris is 2 degrees C. And I would argue that 1.5 degrees C is already built into the system, and I'll explain why later. The Paris pathway, if we let only the current commitments proceed, will end up with 3 degrees C, quite possibly by the middle of the century. And 4 degrees C is the path we're currently on. Now, 1 means we're already hitting tipping points in the Arctic and West Antarctic ice sheet. 2 means extremely dangerous climate change. We're already hitting dangerous climate change at 1 degree C. 3, in the opinion of many of the best national security experts around the world, is outright social chaos. And 4 is incompatible in their eyes with an organized human global community. In other words, global collapse. Now that's the reality, I think, of the path we're currently on. And the average temperature in Australia last year in 2019 was 1.8 degrees C compared with pre-industrial levels. 1.5, we say, well, we have to stay below 1.5. In my view, it's not possible. If you look at any of the modeling that's been done, and this shows the general pathways and the dotted lines here, three options if emissions don't peak on the upper lines, if we take the Paris cuts plus later action faster, or radical cuts, the two lower lines. 1.5 degrees C is going to happen by 2030, whatever we do, irrespective of any action that is taken from now on. It's locked in. So the struggle now is to stop things becoming worse and stay below 2. And, you know, that's the reality I think we're really facing. If you look at 3 degrees C, it's quite possible we'll hit 3 degrees C by 2050. We tend to talk in terms of graphs and models and what have you, but what does it really mean? And these are the sorts of things that we may be facing around the world. This is particularly more focused onto the Asian region in some ways, but ecosystem collapse around the world, deadly heat days above 100 days per annum in many parts of the world, sea level rise certainly greater than 0.5 meters. Many regions becoming uninhabitable, major migration, significant drop in crop yields, and inundation in major agricultural areas, which is part of that. And significant parts of major cities around the world having to be abandoned because of the ingress of seawater. Now, these are the sort of things we're dealing with. We tend not to talk about this. We tend to assume that somehow we'll get to the numbers, it'll all be well. But these things are now already happening. The bushfires in Australia, I would argue, are the beginning of perhaps regional or local tipping points. And that's the next big issue, because if you look at the IPCC work, one of the things that is not included is quantification of the so-called tipping points, which are the areas around the world where you might suddenly get a nonlinear change in the climate system. I mean, climate doesn't change in a linear sense. You get positive feedback loops. And I mean, this is quite a well-known diagram from the Potsdam Institute of 15 or so of the tipping points around the world that might get triggered in the next few years. And 2 of those probably already have been triggered. The West Antarctic ice sheet and the Arctic ice sheet. Now, there are concerns that around 9 of those 15 are starting to show signs of moving. And once those are triggered, they become locked in, and there's very little we can do about it. And with some of them, it's game over as far as climate is concerned. We will just get into an escalating range of problems. So we really have to treat this with far greater urgency than I think we're now seeing around the world. And these things are not, as I said, quantified in the IPCC work so far, for good reasons, because it's very hard to quantify them. We know they're there, but they're not included in the risk assessment, and risk is the critical issue on this. So what is the framework we have to move forward with? Well, I'd suggest the following: that we have to accept that this represents an immediate existential threat to human civilization. The threat is immediate in the sense that we are now locking in those types of problems with tipping points by continuing to commit to fossil fuel investment. I mean, with all the good talk around the world, we are spending far more on fossil fuels at the moment than we are on renewables. And that has been the case for the last decade. We require fundamentally different approaches to the governance and risk management of climate change from anything we've seen in conventional risk management practice, which means you have to say, we have a target, we're here today, we have to get there tomorrow, and we have to take every possible option to do it. There is no choice. It's not a question of what is politically feasible, it's a question of how do we do this. We've done it before. You do it in wartime situations when you have a very clear threat. And I don't particularly like using the wartime analogy, but that is the type of approach you really have to use. The only way now, in my view, of avoiding irreversible climate change is if we have rapid carbon emission reductions by a small number of the largest state and corporate emitters, maybe the top 10 or 12, 10 or 12 emitters, whether they be countries or companies. We have to get agreement that that now has to happen. It's the only way that we're going to pull emissions down quickly enough. The other things we're all talking about, extremely important technology changes, community action, but they're not going to deliver the speed and extent of the required reduction if we're serious about staying below 2 degrees C. And that means that all fossil fuel expansion must stop now, and the industry wind back. I mean, if you're in this situation, it is pointless continuing to build new fossil fuel projects, whether it's coal, gas, or oil, and at the same time expect the community and the technology industries and so on to be racing to find solutions. I mean, it's completely incompatible. So we have to accept that that is the reality. And that means emergency action in the way you do act, as I said, in a wartime situation. So the idea that the net zero emissions by 2050 is realistic is, in my view, quite wrong. This is what people are now locking into. They're saying, if we achieve this, then we're in good shape. I would suggest that is completely incorrect, and it is just brushing under the carpet the real implications of climate risk. So that's what we have to, I think we really have to reframe the argument in those immediate emergency terms and start talking realistically about the way forward from here. So I'll leave it at that. There are, if people are interested in the background to this, you'll find it in some of the Club of Rome work and in some of the work that the small think tank I work with has been doing over the last few years. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ian. You were also a bit more than 5 minutes, around 10 minutes, but thank you for excellent insight into the climate issue. And I would like to invite now Sheer Kilkish to take over the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join such an important panel. Let me begin by emphasizing that ensuring the protection of planetary life support systems is at the center of all that we should aim for. In contrast, atmospheric CO2 concentrations continue to increase, and once thought more probable for a 3-degree scenario, multiple tipping points from the West Antarctic ice sheet to the thawing of permafrost can also be exceeded in 2-degree and even 1.5-degree scenarios. And all of these tipping points are connected. Currently, constant emissions for the next 8 years will entirely consume the remaining carbon budget for a 1.5-degree scenario. We need to flatten the curve with Herculean reductions. And this needs to go much beyond to 2 degrees, in which starting reductions this year will require a continued mitigation rate of 6% each year. In comparison, the forced confinement during COVID resulted in less than a 10% reduction in total emissions when measured for 4 months. This further underlines the need for systemic transformation for sustained reductions. The rates of change can vary according to different modeling results, with this one adapted from a global study for 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. Major increases in the share of renewable energy throughout the next 30 years are necessary across all sectors, not to mention greater increases in the upcoming years. As renewable energy targets, currently about 50 countries have targets for renewable heating, cooling, and transport, and 170 countries for renewable energy and power, but with various ambitions and timescales. So how can systemic transformation be supported from a policy perspective? Can we design and implement policy instruments that can have a key role for decarbonization better? Can we implement additional policies such as an Exergy tax and an Exergy improvement factor incentive in supporting the renewable energy transition? Boundaries can also influence how we evaluate options. The broader our view, the greater the possibilities to capture missed opportunities of energy resource not being used, wasted, and even curtailed. Power to X options also have a great role in increasing system flexibility in renewable energy systems and supporting factor 5 improvements for resource productivity, including from an Exergy perspective. Paradigm shifts in parameters that we use to measure progress are also important. Here, the useful work potential, or Exergy, in low temperature district heating applications per unit of energy is calculated across various case studies. When compared to the unit Exergy of conventional energy source, the use of low temperature district heating can represent an average Exergy improvement factor of 7.1 across the case studies. A paradigm shift is also necessary to reverse the drivers of urban emissions, particularly through integrating urban and energy planning. Since 1990, urban emissions have been increasing in different parts of the world, reaching to about 23 gigatons of CO2 emissions in recent years, according to this data. Reversing these trends will require solutions combining sufficiency, efficiency, flexibility, renewable energy, and more sustainable urbanization. How will the future evolve? Different pathways, namely shared socioeconomic pathways or SSPs, have been put forth from SSP1 that represents taking a green road to others with different challenges for mitigation and adaptation. These narrative frameworks also relate to different increases in both urban land expansion and changes in total population, as we see in these figures. Limiting urban land expansion and ensuring that per capita emissions are limited with sustainable solutions will be crucial for navigating to more sustainable options. To make an additional point, when we question what has led to increased well-being, one way in which can be measured by measuring life expectancy, increase in income does not have as much as a role. It is actually residential energy use that had the greatest percentage in statistically accounting for increase in life expectancy. When we think about the future, we must also completely realize that greater well-being and the renewable energy transition to decouple sufficient energy use from emissions go hand in hand, including new job opportunities. Addressing the climate emergency requires a renewable energy transition for the benefit of the planet of which we are also part. Clearly, we need rapid action in all of the societal systems from multiple dimensions. This includes enabling sustainable urban systems in support of the renewable energy transition. From integrated urban energy planning to reduce CO2 emissions per capita, we can increase well-being while protecting planetary life support systems. These are my initial statements for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shir, for staying in time schedule. I will now try to move towards the panel questions. And my first question is what we need for 1.5 degrees in energy sector and when. And what we have seen from Ian's presentation and also from Natasha's presentation is that we cannot manage get 1.5 Cs now because we are going to breach that anyway in a few years' time. But when we talk about Paris Agreement, we are thinking about 2100, which Natasha has shown, and that with very rapid transition, energy transition, we can make it until the end of the century. But for sure, by 2025, we are going to breach it. We have seen solutions, and I fully agree with Ernst's position that energy efficiency can actually significantly reduce emissions. Our models are showing that if we move towards renewable energy, towards electrification of transport and heating, we reduce the primary energy need for 50% because of energy efficiency. Electric vehicles, they mean 5 times less, 4 to 5 times less primary energy. Electric heating or district heating also means 2 to 4 times less energy, more energy efficiency. So, but we have to do, in my opinion, the transition all at once, not waiting for something to happen to start with transition in heating and transport sector. What do you think, how should we start with this process of energy transition? Ian mentioned that we should stop investing in fossil fuels. I agree on that, but this is not a simple thing because we also want to avoid too much stranded costs. So what are your take on that? Maybe we can start with Ernst.
Thank you. I start with a psychological thing. In most countries of the world, we have a strong conservative right-wing movement against climate protection. In Poland, in much of the Rust Belt of America, it is a majority of people who fiercely want to stop climate protection, you know? This is the problem. Technical answers don't impress them. They don't want it. They hate it, period. So what can we do there? I got a manuscript of a new book by James Powell, which is called 2084, where a climate scientist looks back into the 2020s or so and asks his, in the literature, he asks, have they not known in 2020 how horrendous the effects of global warming would be? I mean, Ian Dunlop has described the whole thing. And then the answer is, no, they knew it, but they didn't want it. And then the book goes through 15 different chapters, one more horrendous than the other. If we make that a best-selling book, you would see the next parliamentary elections shifting dramatically towards what we need to do.
It seems that in Germany they are shifting towards green positions, but it will be very difficult to put it in many other countries. I agree with you very much. But what I see as an optimistic solution to that problem is that renewables are becoming bigger and bigger business, and that starts to create renewables as lobbies, and then they are managing to fight better and better fossil lobbies. So we are kind of equalizing in a relatively long distance this balance. Other panelists, would you like to comment on this threshold? How to start with the change? Sheer.
It's also a messaging issue. So as stated by in the panel, if we treat this as an emergency, we saw this very clearly in COVID. It was treated as a crisis, and the earlier actions was able to see better results. Same with climate change. The earlier action that is taken, we can have better results. So it is a messaging issue that needs close support from scientific community, as tried to be done with IPCC, but also with this governance from all levels, from national to cities to civil society. We need to be very clear on how this is messaged, so the renewable energy transition can be supported even more.
Thank you. Natasha?
I would also just want to support that this is a matter of lobby and psychological issue, and with the maturity of low carbon technologies and processes, we have an additional argument in hand, because we can market low carbon development based on the economic analysis, and I can talk about the latest analysis from my country. We have 60% of low carbon development measures are with negative costs. So compared to our reference scenarios, if we go further with current policies, and we have a scenario which is much cheaper than decarbonization scenario is much cheaper than fossil fuel based scenario. So this is another argument in hand to use in marketing the decarbonization pathways over the fossil fuel based. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian? you want to add something? Yes?
Yes, thank you. I think we are at quite an unusual point. I mean, Ernst's comment, I think, is perfectly correct. There's been enormous resistance to accepting the realities of climate change because we've essentially had a world that's grown rich, at least some parts of the world, not all, on fossil fuels. The people who run those industries have gained enormous political power, and that's not something they want to give up terribly readily. Now, it's very hard, I think, for people who've been in an industry for 50 years and it's always grown and it's always had, I guess, its hands on the levers of power, to accept they're going to have to give way to other alternatives. But I think what's happening is that if you look at the pandemic, we must realize that all these things are linked. I mean, as populations increased, as economic growth has increased, as the Club of Rome work back in the 70s, the limits of growth highlighted, we were going to get into problems, and we are, because the encroachment of humanity into natural areas, the destruction of the biosphere and biodiversity, all of these things are starting to result in events that we should have expected, we were warned, like the pandemic, which comes from, in part, climate change, because of the increasing temperatures, the pressures on people to move into these natural areas and so on. So we've suddenly realized that we now have a genuine existential threat in the sense of this pandemic. We've also suddenly discovered that we can actually do things that people previously believed completely impossible. In other words, we're now moving away from free market economics. We're using Keynesian stimulus measures to prop up economies. It's clearly perfectly obvious that the private sector, as it's currently constituted economically, is incapable of handling a problem like the pandemic. And so we have a role for governments, which previously was not thought to be there, or at least the conventional wisdom in the Western world, not in every part of the world certainly, was the role of government was diminishing. Now, we at the same time are finding that the cost of the transition is now to a low carbon world is actually much lower than it used to be. So these factors have all come together, and it provides, I think, a completely different context to make the transition extremely quickly, provided we recognize risk. And the problem with a lot of this debate is that we have never really understood what the risks of climate change are. I think scientifically, for various reasons, they have been downplayed. In things like the tipping point issue, they're not quantified for often good reasons. The fact is those risks are there, and it's now becoming clear from the events around the world that these things are happening. I mean, we've seen it in Australia in the last years.
Okay.
If you look at, just to finish off, if you look at Northern Europe now in Siberia, what is going to happen to the Russian oil industry as permafrost starts to melt? We're already seeing some problems. So we have to use this opportunity to, I think, develop a constructive way forward where all of the parties can start coming together, recognizing that we have now circumstances which are a threat to everybody. So we need far greater global cooperation we've ever seen before. And of course, unfortunately, at the moment, we have leaders who are not demonstrating that.
Yes, on the question of the speed of transition, I have a good example of Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Norte, which in 4 years managed to increase share of wind from 0 to 260%. And no technical problem happened. So we should start helping those cases that want to do the transition. You have also the case of Elon Musk in electric car, which looked like a joke 10 years ago, but today it's the most valuable car company. The smart money is on Musk, and the rest of the fossil fuel cars are dead. And they now know if they want to survive, they have to quickly get out with electric cars. And most probably they will not survive because they don't know how to do electric cars.
Nevin,
So the transition can be very quick.
Most of the electricity comes from coal.
Well, in some countries like Australia, yes, but in Europe, it's relatively renewable already.
Europe is
I
tiny
mean,
compared to
what-
China, India, South Africa,
yes,
etc.
it's
So
true, but even if...
electricity alone is not the answer.
Sorry?
Electricity alone is not the answer, because you have
Okay.
to say where the electricity comes from.
Yes, I fully agree on that, but we are fast now decarbonizing power sector. I think we cannot wait for the power sector to be fully renewable to start with the electrification of other sectors, because then we are too late.
I'm in
We
favor
have
of
to
electricity, but don't forget the efficiency point and the massive increase of renewables. Otherwise, electricity doesn't help.
Yes, I agree, but electric car is 4 times more efficient than internal combustion engine. So by switching to electric car, even if you're using coal electricity, you are staying on the same level. But if you move to wind and solar electricity, you are 4 times better. So it can actually be done. But on the other hand, we have, according to International Monetary Fund, subsidies in the amount of $4,000 billion per year. That's a problem. And why can't we talk about that? When I start this issue of subsidies, they say, where are the subsidies? Of course, they're hidden.
Bravo, that's the right point.
Yes. So we have to work how to remove those subsidies. But it seems it's very difficult because of the reasons you mentioned. So can we start attacking technologies that have no future, like heating on gas? If we look at the Exergy districts, it's clearly pointing into district heating and heat pumps, but we are still selling gas boilers. What do you think about these new technologies? You know, I don't see them being taken in quickly. We also have a question from the public, which I would like to join, is how to do it in Africa, because the electric cars are still expensive. Do you have a take on that, how to do it quickly enough? Now we know that in developed countries, cars are going to be electric. What to do with the developing one? I don't know.
China, which is the champion of electric cars, the inventor of the electric cars is now saying, this is the second best. We have to move to hydrogen.
What about hydrogen? What do you think? What is the role of hydrogen in the whole transition process?
It's fantastic. We need to expand it. But of course, also hydrogen doesn't grow on trees. It has to be manufactured. And so the origin of the hydrogen economy must be renewables.
Okay, but that is in a way against your energy efficiency as the most important thing, because hydrogen is not very energy efficient.
It is not less efficient than electricity is. It's almost...
I don't agree. I have calculated, and it looks like we need maybe 5 to 10 times more primary energy if we do heating with hydrogen or e-fuels than with electricity. Can you explain how do we heat with hydrogen?
Heating is mostly wasteful. I'm living in a so-called passive house, which essentially needs no heating, period.
Yes, I fully agree on that point. We should definitely go towards nearly zero energy buildings, but this is something that will take a very long period of time. So we can't really do that quickly. And we still have to do some heating of the left remaining of the buildings. So this is how much electricity we need to heat Europe, 1.6 terawatt hours. And this is how much we need if we do it using hydrogen-based synthetic fuels. It's quite inefficient way, in my opinion.
You're perfectly right. Heating is almost a sin, but we can do architecture and design that heating more or less disappears from the energy budget.
Yes,
but it will happen only if prices tell the truth. The problem with these subsidies, which you correctly mentioned, is intended to make energy cheap, and that is the sin. As long as it's cheap, we need a lot of heating power. You know, these
maybe
that you show.
We can ask Sheer about that, because she is a lead author on the subject of cities. Yeah. So Sheer.
So cities have an opportunity to direct the investments and to avoid the lock-in. So even if our renewable electricity is not 100% renewable now, investing in transport options that have the electricity will enable us to more quickly transition and to avoid additional lock-in to inefficient and carbon-intensive forms of transport. So as much as possible, we can accelerate the electrification of transport, and in the meantime, increasing the renewable energy share in the entire power sector. This will be a good strategy to follow. And on the question on Africa, we can also broaden thinking about different finance mechanisms. For community financing or crowdsourced financing or different alternatives. There's more than one. So maybe in that case, what can be different alternatives while increasing the investments into also making the leap in Africa in the transport sector. So we need to ensure that also the global south is able to leapfrog in these technologies. With the question of heating and decarbonization of heating, for too long of a time, we have talked about layered policies. We support this and we also support that. But currently we're seeing that policies that are removing or trying to ban certain inefficient technologies, this is the way to go, because time is very limited. So if we're able to direct policies into the right direction and not trying to support everything at the same time, but actually limiting what would lock in additional CO2 emissions, this could be an effective way considering the limited time ahead of us.
Thank you. I think we have spent the time for panel discussion. I would like to invite attendees to put questions under questions and answer. We already kind of answered 2 questions, and I have one more question, which is from Tobias Orton, which is about the role of bioeconomy. He thinks that we need area for production of food, and we should not lean so much on bioeconomy. We should be careful how we use area. But can we actually do it without bioeconomy? What about biorefineries and plastics? How can we fully decarbonize economy without bioeconomy? That's a question. Any of the panelists can answer that?
Yes. I mean, from the point of view of biodiversity, the so-called bioeconomy is stupid. It destroys wild areas, the last remains for wildlife.
Okay, Ian wanted to talk, to answer that question also.
Yeah, look, I think you have to be very careful with, I think the bioeconomy. I mean, the question of land availability and the way we're going to use it with an increasing population is going to be becoming, more and more a concern. So we have to be quite realistic about the trade-offs between food and, bioenergy and what have you. And particularly some of these ideas on negative emission technologies, because they could potentially become extremely consumptive of land areas and so on. On the other hand, you have a lot of potentially very attractive sequestration options in terms of increasing soil carbon around the world, increasing agricultural productivity and what have you, if it's done properly. But I think with all of these technologies, I mean, there are big question marks on virtually everything you look at. What it really needs is a coming together of the best possible expertise we can get within a policy framework that recognizes the real risk implications of what we now have to address. And I don't think we've got that in any country in the world at this point in time. I mean, we really are going to, particularly in countries like African countries and so on, we need to find ways and means of getting that expertise dispersed around the world, and each country will be different, and there isn't one size fit all. It's going to be very different depending on the circumstances that each country has. So there's a tremendous amount of noise, I guess, around technologies and what's coming to the fore and what isn't, and whether one is better than the other. But what it lacks is a context, and the context has to be risk, and how fast you've got to move, and how you can put these things together in an integrated sense to come up with the sort of overall solutions we need in terms of emission reduction, as well as maintaining the economies of society in a sustainable manner. And that's a much bigger picture, I think, than we've tended to accept so far.
We have come to the time of ending the panel, but before we end it, I would like that panelists give a final thought, up to a minute each. Who is going to take the opportunity first?
Let's start the other direction this time with Shir.
Okay, so Shir.
So a big focus of our discussion has been how and how fast. And I think the answer to that is as quickly as possible, as bold as possible, and trying to align the right policies, the right metrics, the right parameters with the effective governance structures and the options that are available to us, both by behavioral, structural change, and supporting this, and using all of this to support the renewable energy transition. So in final thoughts, we need to accelerate as much as possible, use also cities to accelerate the transition. Also on the demand side and the supply side, cities have a lot of solutions to offer, including district energy options and more efficient public transport options. And so we need to use all the opportunities that we have and to accelerate this transition, because time is very, very limited.
Thank you. Ian?
Okay, well, I think we are, as I said, at a completely unique point in human history where a number of things have come together to wake us up to the fact that we are now facing completely unexpected risks. We have got to have more global cooperation than we've ever seen before, and the world at the moment is going in the opposite direction. Now, what we need is a bottom-up pressure from the community to pick up on those points and recognize that it's in everybody's interest now to move forward on these issues far faster than we've seen. And that pressure, we need leaders also who can accept that. But I think in the end, it's going to be civil society that is now going to create that pressure and get leaders to start picking up on reality of climate risk. What the positive point, I think, is we now have the technologies to do that, and they are in many cases more economic than maintaining the status quo.
Thank you. Natasha?
Most of my thoughts were taken from the previous speakers. I would say we should go for smart energy systems, smart solutions, which will enable integration, and sector coupling, electrification, and the remaining part of what the things which cannot be electrified, then we have to go with biomass or other technologies which will include a lot of efficiency. That's it from my side. Smart is the energy.
Thank you. Ernst?
Let me only add that those climate-friendly technologies have to become profitable. They are not now, or only exceptionally. And we have to stabilize population in the world. It is completely mad if population is growing.
Thank you. Thank you, all panelists. Well, I would like to conclude that most of us agree that techno-economically we have now solutions, but the barriers are mostly in lobbies, subsidies, psychology, and we have to fight those things and open the space for people that can implement transition quickly, because we need it extremely quickly now in order to save the climate. Thank you very much to everyone, to the attendees and panelists, and I would like to close this session now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Janani, you can now stop recording.
Okay, thank you. We will do that. And could we close the webinar as well?
Yes, you can close the webinar. Maybe you can leave panelists for a few minutes just to have a final word.
I think we will not be able to stop the broadcast. So.
Okay. So let's close it. Thank you again.
Yes, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Welcome.